My name is Claire Bennett, and on the morning my divorce trial began, my husband leaned toward me with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. You'll leave this courtroom with nothing, he whispered. His expensive cologne filled the air as he smiled. Across the aisle, the woman he'd been seeing for nearly a year folded her arms and smirked. She didn't even try to hide it. I almost feel sorry for her, she muttered loudly enough for several people to hear. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked through the tall courthouse windows toward Lower Manhattan. Morning sunlight reflected off the glass towers, making the city sparkle as if nothing in the world could ever fall apart. 3 years earlier, those words would have shattered me. That morning, they meant nothing, because I already knew something neither of them did. But to understand why, you have to go back 16 years. I met Daniel Bennett in Brooklyn when we were both 24. He was brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely broke. I was working as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm in Midtown. My salary wasn't extraordinary, but it was stable. Stable enough to pay rent on our tiny apartment and keep the lights on while Daniel chased his dream. He wanted to build a cybersecurity company. Everyone called it unrealistic. Everyone except me. I believed in him so completely that it never crossed my mind to ask what would happen if his dream ever came true. 2 years later, we got married in a small ceremony overlooking the Hudson River. We made a promise that felt simple. I'll take care of today, I told him. And one day, he smiled, squeezing my hands. I'll take care of the rest of our lives. I believed every word. The first 5 years were brutal. His company barely survived. Some months we couldn't even pay ourselves. Whenever payroll was due, I quietly covered groceries, rent, utilities, insurance, even business software subscriptions. Without complaining, I sold the engagement ring my grandmother had left me. Daniel never asked me to. He didn't even know. I simply told him I'd misplaced it, because watching him give up would have hurt more than losing any piece of jewelry. Every night he'd apologize. I swear, he'd say, exhausted after another 16-hour workday, when this company finally makes it, everything I build will belong to both of us. I always smiled. I know. And I truly did. At least, I thought I did. By the time Daniel turned 34, everything changed. A major bank signed a contract with his company. Then another. Then another. Within 18 months, Bennett Cyber Systems went from a struggling startup to one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms in New York. Suddenly, Daniel was everywhere. Business magazines, tech conferences, podcasts, charity galas in Manhattan hotels where people wore watches worth more than our first apartment. At first, I was proud. I still remember standing in the back of a ballroom at the Plaza Hotel while he accepted an award. Everyone applauded. I applauded louder than anyone, because I'd seen the nights no one else had seen. The failures, the panic attacks, the unpaid invoices. I thought success would bring us closer. Instead, it began pulling him away. He stopped asking about my day. Dinners became conversations about investors, acquisitions, and expansion plans. When I mentioned finally applying for an executive finance program I'd postponed for years, he barely looked up from his phone. Why? The question stunned me. What do you mean, why? You don't need another degree. I stared at him. I've wanted this for years. Claire, we're not struggling anymore. Enjoy life. It sounded reasonable, but something about it felt wrong. Little by little, I noticed other changes. He started taking calls in the hallway. He added passwords to devices we'd always shared. Weekend plans disappeared because of client meetings. Then one rainy Thursday, while organizing documents for our accountant, I found hotel receipts that didn't match any trip on his calendar. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I simply started paying attention. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop seeing things. Deleted messages. Sudden business trips. Expenses routed through accounts I didn't recognize. Then came the moment that changed everything. I arrived early to his office one evening to bring him dinner. His assistant wasn't at the desk, so I walked toward the conference room. The door was slightly open. Daniel was inside with his attorney. I want everything structured before I file, he said. If we move the holdings now, the division becomes much cleaner. I froze. The attorney lowered his voice, but I heard enough. As long as the transfers are documented properly, we can position the assets before the divorce is filed. Divorce. My husband was planning one. And he was planning it before telling me. I walked out without making a sound. That night I sat alone in our apartment overlooking the East River until sunrise. No tears. No screaming. Just silence. At 6 in the morning, I made a decision. If Daniel had already ended the marriage in his mind, I wasn't going to beg him to stay. I was going to prepare. That same day, I hired Margaret Stein, a divorce attorney known for handling high-net-worth cases in Manhattan. When I placed my boxes of records on her desk, she raised an eyebrow. "How much documentation do you have?" I opened the first box. Bank statements, tax returns, loan agreements, emails, receipts. 16 years of them. Margaret looked genuinely impressed. "Claire," she said slowly, "most people come in with emotions. You came in with evidence." I closed the folder. "Numbers don't forget." She smiled for the first time. "Good," she said. "Because I think your husband is about to learn that." The divorce papers arrived 2 weeks later. There were no apologies. No conversation. Just a courier standing outside my apartment with a large envelope and a polite smile. Daniel hadn't even handed them to me himself. That told me everything I needed to know. Word spread quickly through Manhattan's business circles. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly started calling. Some wanted to check on me. Others simply couldn't resist sharing what they'd heard. "Daniel says the company was his long before you. They're saying you never took any risks. People think you're trying to cash in on his success." Every rumor sounded almost identical. Apparently, Daniel had been telling everyone the same story, that he had built his empire alone while I simply enjoyed the rewards. I never corrected anyone. The truth didn't need a public relations campaign. It only needed the right moment. Meanwhile, Margaret and I worked quietly. Every evening after work, I met her at her office overlooking Bryant Park. The conference table slowly disappeared beneath stacks of binders. We created timelines, cross-checked bank transfers, matched emails with financial records, tracked every dollar that had kept Daniel's company alive during its earliest years. One evening, Margaret leaned back in her chair. "I've handled billion-dollar divorces," she said. "But I've never seen someone organize 16 years of financial history like this." I smiled faintly. "I've been an analyst my entire career." She laughed. "I can tell." Then she became serious. "Claire, there's something here." She slid one email toward me. Daniel had written it 13 years earlier at 3 o'clock in the morning. "I know everyone thinks this company is mine, but the truth is different. You're carrying both of us while I chase this dream. One day, when people call me successful, they'll never know your name. But I'll always know none of this would exist without you." I stared at the screen for several seconds. I had forgotten that message even existed. Margaret hadn't. She carefully placed it into a separate folder. "This," she said quietly, "isn't just sentimental. It's an admission." The night before the hearing, she handed me a thin cream-colored envelope. "What's this?" "Our entire case," she replied. I frowned. "That's impossible." She smiled. "The binders contain thousands of pages. This contains the 12 that matter most." Inside was a concise timeline supported by the strongest evidence we had: financial records, emails, signed loan documents, and one simple narrative connecting them all. No dramatic language. No accusations. Only facts. I sealed the envelope myself. The next morning, the Manhattan Supreme Court buzzed with reporters, attorneys, and executives waiting for their own hearings. Daniel arrived wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first annual salary. Walking beside him was Vanessa Cole, the woman from the hotel receipts. She looked around the courtroom as though she'd already won. Daniel caught my eye. He smiled. "You could have accepted my settlement," he said quietly. "It would have saved you today's embarrassment." I met his gaze without blinking. "You seem very confident." "I am. Before I could answer, the courtroom doors opened. All rise. The judge entered. As everyone stood, I reached into my briefcase and quietly placed the sealed, cream-colored envelope into Margaret's hands. "Whenever the time is right," I whispered. She nodded once. Then the hearing began. The courtroom settled into complete silence as Judge Eleanor Brooks adjusted her glasses and looked over the case file. Daniel's attorney stood first. "Your Honor," he began confidently, "Mr. Bennett transformed a small startup into one of New York's leading cybersecurity companies through his own vision, leadership, and personal effort. While Mrs. Bennett was his spouse, she played no meaningful role in the creation or growth of the business." Daniel nodded slightly. He didn't even look at me. His confidence filled the room. His attorney continued. "The company should therefore remain Mr. Bennett's separate property, and we respectfully request that the court recognize it as such." The judge made a brief note before turning toward Margaret. "Mrs. Stein." Margaret stood calmly. "Will respond, Your Honor." She didn't interrupt the opposing counsel. She didn't accuse anyone of lying. Instead, she walked toward the clerk's desk carrying the cream-colored envelope I'd given her earlier. "I'd like to submit a supplemental summary prepared by my client." The judge looked at the envelope. "What exactly am I reviewing?" "A concise timeline connecting every financial record already included in discovery." The judge accepted it. "I'll take a look." The room became perfectly still. Daniel folded his arms, looking almost bored. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, scrolling through her phone before putting it away with an amused smile. Neither of them seemed remotely concerned. Judge Brooks carefully opened the envelope. She began reading. One page, then another. She slowed down. Her eyes returned to a paragraph she'd already passed. She read it again. Then she reached for the supporting exhibits already included in the case file. She compared dates, highlighted figures, bank transfers, loan documents, corporate filings. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Finally, she looked up. "Mrs. Bennett." "Yes, Your Honor." "You prepared this timeline yourself?" "I did." "You work in finance?" "For nearly 17 years." She nodded thoughtfully. "It shows." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. For the first time that morning, he looked uncertain. The judge continued reading. March 2012. Claire Bennett transferred $42,000 from her personal investment account into the company's operating account after a major investor withdrew funding. Supporting bank records attached. August 2013. Claire refinanced her condominium to provide additional liquidity while the business operated at a loss. Mortgage records attached. January 2014. Claire postponed an executive MBA program after assuming full responsibility for household expenses, allowing Daniel Bennett to work without taking a salary. Payroll and tax records attached. The judge quietly turned another page. Then she stopped. This email. She lifted a printed copy. It had been written by Daniel years before. "You didn't just support me. You saved this company. Every opportunity one have exists because you believed when no one else did." The judge looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Bennett." He straightened in his chair. "Did you write this email?" Daniel swallowed. "Yes." His attorney immediately leaned forward. "Your Honor, we'd like to point out that personal correspondence should be viewed within." The judge raised a hand. "I understand." She continued reading anyway. Another email. "If anyone deserves to be called a founder, it's you." Another. "I couldn't have kept this company alive without your money." Another. "One day, everything we build will belong to both of us." The courtroom had become so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock seemed unusually loud. Daniel no longer looked confident. Vanessa slowly lowered her eyes. Judge Brooks closed the final page of the timeline. Then she reached for the financial exhibits one more time. She compared one specific bank transfer with Daniel's earlier testimony. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. She picked up her pen and wrote something in the margin of the case file. No one in the courtroom knew exactly what it was, but everyone could feel that something had just shifted. Judge Brooks rested her hands on the bench and looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Bennett, I'd like to clarify part of your testimony. Of course, Your Honor. You stated under oath that, after the company's first year, its growth was financed exclusively through business revenue and your personal investments. That's correct. The judge nodded once. Then perhaps you can explain Exhibit 47. She lifted a single document from the stack. Daniel's attorney immediately reached for his own copy. The color drained from his face before he even finished reading the first page. Judge Brooks continued. On April 18, 2012, $42,000 were deposited into Bennett Cyber Systems. She glanced at Daniel. You identified this transaction during your deposition as one of your personal investments. Yes. The judge slid another document beside it. According to certified bank records, that money came directly from Mrs. Bennett's investment account. Silence. Daniel frowned. There must be some misunderstanding. There isn't, the judge replied calmly. She held up another document. The transfer left Mrs. Bennett's account at 9:14 that morning. Another page. It arrived in your company's operating account at 9:31. Another. Both transactions carry the same reference number. Daniel's attorney stood. Your Honor, perhaps we're discussing a bookkeeping error from many years ago. Judge Brooks looked at him. Counselor. Her voice remained perfectly calm. I've reviewed the banking records supplied by 3 separate financial institutions. She paused. I don't believe all 3 institutions made the same bookkeeping error. A faint ripple moved through the courtroom. Even several attorneys waiting for later hearings looked up from their laptops. Judge Brooks turned another page. Let's continue. She pointed to another entry. Between 2012 and 2016, Mrs. Bennett paid nearly every household expense. Mortgage, insurance, utilities, property taxes, health coverage. The judge read each item aloud. So while your company was operating without consistent profit, she said, your household continued functioning because Mrs. Bennett's salary covered virtually every recurring expense. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I was focused on growing the business. I'm aware. The judge nodded. My question is different. She leaned forward slightly. If Mrs. Bennett had not assumed those financial obligations, would your company have survived? For the first time that day, Daniel didn't answer. His attorney whispered something urgently. Daniel cleared his throat. I can't say for certain. Judge Brooks made another note. Thank you. She reached for one final exhibit. This is the document that interests me most. Margaret glanced toward me but said nothing. Even she hadn't expected the judge to focus on this page so quickly. The judge held up a signed personal guarantee. In 2013, when your company applied for an emergency operating line of credit, the bank required additional collateral. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, the guarantee wasn't signed by you. He blinked. It was signed by Mrs. Bennett. Another silence. If the company had defaulted, the judge looked directly at him. Mrs. Bennett, not you, would have been personally responsible for the debt. Daniel stared at the document. His voice faded. The judge waited. Was that statement accurate? Several endless seconds passed. Finally, yes. The word barely escaped his lips. Vanessa's confident expression disappeared. She looked at Daniel as though she were seeing him for the first time. Judge Brooks quietly placed the document back onto the bench. Interesting. She picked up another folder. This court has now identified several financial disclosures that appear inconsistent with the testimony previously given. Daniel's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, we'd respectfully request a short recess. The judge considered the request for a moment. Then she slowly closed the folder. I'll decide on that request. She looked toward the clerk. After we discuss one final transaction. Daniel's eyes widened. He had no idea which transaction she meant. But Margaret did. She smiled almost imperceptibly. Because buried deep within the financial records was one document Daniel had completely forgotten existed. And if the judge had truly found it, everything was about to change. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Brooks opened the final folder. She adjusted the document in front of her and looked toward Daniel. Mr. Bennett, I'd like to discuss a statement you signed in June of 2014. Daniel's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, may I ask which document we're referring to? The company's credit application submitted to Metropolitan Commercial Bank. Margaret quietly smiled. She recognized it instantly. Daniel, however, looked completely confused. I don't remember every document I signed 12 years ago. I don't expect you to, the judge replied. That's why I have a copy. She lifted the original application. Every page carried Daniel's signature. The final section was highlighted. Judge Brooks began reading aloud. The continued operation of Bennett Cyber Systems has been made possible through the financial support, personal guarantees, and private capital provided by my wife, Claire Bennett. Without her contributions, the company would not have remained solvent during its early stages. No one moved. No one spoke. The judge looked up. Mr. Bennett, did you sign the statement? Daniel swallowed. Yes. And at the time you signed it, was it true? His attorney leaned closer. Daniel. But there was nowhere left to hide. Yes. The word echoed through the courtroom. Judge Brooks slowly placed the document beside the timeline Claire had prepared. Interesting. She turned another page. The bank approved your emergency line of credit based partly on this declaration. Another page. The investors who joined 6 months later received copies of the same financial disclosures. She looked directly at Daniel. So when you testified before this court that your company was built solely through your own resources, that statement conflicted with documents you personally submitted to financial institutions. Daniel lowered his eyes. It wasn't my intention to mislead the court. No, the judge's voice remained calm. Then help me understand. She folded her hands. Were your statements to the bank truthful? Or were your statements to this court truthful? The question hung in the air. Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His attorney quietly closed his notebook. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, he had no objection, no argument, no explanation. Judge Brooks nodded once. I believe I've heard enough. She looked toward both legal teams. Given the discrepancies between today's testimony and the documented financial record, this court is ordering a complete independent forensic accounting review of Bennett Cyber Systems. A murmur spread across the courtroom. A forensic audit. It wasn't just about dividing property anymore. Every transfer, every investment, every corporate filing would now be examined by independent financial experts. Daniel's face turned pale. He understood exactly what that meant. If anything had been hidden, it would be found. The judge continued. Until that review is complete, no final ruling regarding the division of marital assets will be issued. She struck the gavel lightly. Court is adjourned. People slowly began leaving the courtroom. Reporters rushed into the hallway. Attorneys gathered their files. Vanessa stood near the exit, staring at Daniel. He walked toward her. She looked at him for several seconds, then quietly asked, "You told me she never helped." Daniel couldn't answer. Without another word, Vanessa turned around and walked away. Daniel remained standing alone in the nearly empty courtroom. For the first time in 16 years. Success, money, status, none of it seemed capable of helping him. As I picked up my briefcase, I felt someone behind me. Claire. His voice was barely above a whisper. I turned. There was no arrogance left in his eyes. Only regret. We need to talk. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I simply replied, "Not today." And I walked out into the streets of Manhattan, leaving him standing alone beneath the courthouse lights. 3 weeks later, the courtroom filled once again. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. No whispered jokes. No smug smiles. No reporters expecting another routine divorce hearing. Everyone knew the independent forensic accountants had finished their investigation. The thick report now sat on Judge Brooks' bench. Nearly 800 pages. Every dollar. Every transfer. Every corporate record. Every investment made over 16 years had been examined. Judge Brooks opened the report. The court-appointed forensic team has completed its review. She looked toward both attorneys. The findings are clear. Daniel sat motionless. Margaret folded her hands calmly. The review confirms that Mrs. Bennett made substantial documented financial contributions during the company's most vulnerable years. The judge continued. It further confirms that Mrs. Bennett personally guaranteed multiple loans, financed operating expenses, and assumed nearly all household financial obligations while Mr. Bennett reinvested company revenue. She paused before turning another page. The investigators also identified several assets that were not fully disclosed in the original financial statements. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Daniel closed his eyes. He already knew what was coming. Judge Brooks continued. These include 2 investment accounts, company stock options, and an ownership interest in a recently established holding company. Daniel's attorney slowly lowered his head. There was nothing left to dispute. The evidence spoke for itself. The judge looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Bennett, you signed these disclosure forms under penalty of perjury. Can you explain why these assets were omitted? Daniel remained silent. After several seconds, he finally answered. I was advised. He stopped himself. Then he shook his head. No. His voice became steadier. That's not true. He looked across the courtroom. Straight at me. It was my decision. The room became perfectly still. I convinced myself that everything I'd built belonged only to me. His words were no longer directed at the judge. They were directed at me. I kept telling myself that once the company became successful, the years before success didn't matter anymore. His eyes filled with regret. But they did. He took a slow breath. I wouldn't have survived those years without Claire. No investor believed in me. No bank trusted me. No employee stayed because of me alone. He looked down at his hands. She carried us. She carried me. I just stopped admitting it. No one interrupted him. Not even his attorney. Judge Brooks allowed the silence to linger before speaking. Mr. Bennett, I appreciate your honesty, but today's hearing is about facts. She closed the report, and the facts are now well established. She announced that the omitted assets would be added to the marital estate and considered during the final division of property. Daniel simply nodded. There was no fight left in him. As the hearing ended, people quietly began leaving the courtroom. Margaret smiled at me. You were right. I looked at her. About what? She gathered her files. You said the truth wouldn't need to be louder than the lies. She smiled. It wasn't. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. Not because I had one, but because I no longer felt invisible. The final hearing lasted less than 30 minutes. After months of investigations, thousands of pages of financial records, and countless hours of testimony, there was very little left to debate. Judge Brooks entered the courtroom carrying a single folder. Everyone stood. When she sat down, she looked first at Daniel, then at me. The court has completed its review of all evidence. She paused. The financial record clearly establishes that Mrs. Claire Bennett made significant and measurable contributions to the creation, survival, and growth of Bennett Cyber Systems. She turned one page. Those contributions were not merely emotional or domestic. They were financial. They were contractual. And they were essential. The courtroom remained silent. Accordingly, the court orders an equitable division of the marital estate, including all verified business interests, investment accounts, stock options, and related assets identified during the forensic review. There it was. No dramatic speech. No triumphant celebration. Just justice. Judge Brooks closed the file. There is one final observation I'd like to make. Both attorneys looked up. Businesses are often built by more than the person whose name appears on the office door. She glanced toward Daniel. Success has many witnesses, but sacrifice usually has only one. Then she struck the gavel. This matter is concluded. For a moment, no one moved. People slowly began leaving the courtroom. Reporters rushed outside. Lawyers exchanged handshakes. Margaret quietly squeezed my shoulder. You can finally breathe. I smiled. I think I already am. Outside, the summer air felt different. The streets of Lower Manhattan buzzed with taxis, tourists, and office workers who had no idea that one chapter of my life had just ended forever. As I reached the courthouse steps, someone called my name. Claire. I turned. Daniel stood several feet away. For the first time in years. He looked like the young man I'd met in Brooklyn. Not the CEO. Not the public figure. Just Daniel. I owe you something. I didn't answer. I spent years believing success erased the past. He shook his head. But success only made me forget who carried me through it. His eyes filled with regret. I can't change what I did. I know. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know. He looked down before speaking again. I just needed to say thank you. And I'm sorry. I studied his face for a long moment. Months earlier, I had imagined this conversation countless times. I thought hearing those words would heal everything. They didn't. Because healing had already happened before he spoke them. I hope you find peace, Daniel. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't revenge. It was freedom. I walked away without looking back. 2 months later, I signed the lease for a bright office overlooking Madison Square Park. Instead of buying a larger apartment or an expensive car, I invested in something I had postponed for nearly 2 decades. My own financial consulting firm. Its mission was simple: helping family-owned businesses grow without losing the people who helped build them. On opening day, my first client was a young couple launching a technology startup. As they nervously explained their dreams, I smiled. I saw a younger version of myself sitting across the table. Only this time, I made sure both names appeared on every document. As they left, the wife thanked me. You've given us confidence. I locked the office door that evening and stood by the window overlooking the city skyline. Years ago, I believed my greatest achievement would be helping someone else build their future. I was wrong. The strongest foundation I would ever build was the one beneath my own life. And for the first time in a very long time, it belonged entirely to me.